Hi, this is Kiran Mandral, and I'm back with yet another episode of Chasing Creativity. Today, I have with me Madhurita Anand, who is a very multifaceted person. She's a writer, she's a filmmaker, and she's recently launched Free for Safety, which is a safety app for women. Welcome to the podcast, Madhurita.
Hi, Kiran. So happy to be here.
You are very inspiring because you started off in a career back at a time when I think not many women got into this space.
Yes, that's true. Yeah.
And I'm very curious to know at a time when all parents would be like, doctor banna hai, engineer banna hai. How did filmmaking and Jamia and all that come to you?
So actually, when I was in college, I had this big streak of sort of activism. And as it does happen, you're very idealistic. I'd gone to boarding school and there I used to paint. I used to love art. I actually had a very good teacher. And he really led us, he sort of showed us all the art, and I think he taught us to see. My family also is very creative. My uncle used to actually take black and white photos and develop them in the house.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah, my my father died when I was 7, and we moved to my grandmother's house. And there he was, So I think that's where the love of the image perhaps started. Also, we lived right opposite Plaza Cinema.
Okay.
Which was a big cinema in Delhi. And every Friday, at the time, there used to be these posters that used to be actually brought down and put up. And so we used to watch that whole process of it going up and sort of coming down and everything. So somewhere, how it is in your subconscious as a kid, there's lovely images, people are interested in images. And storytelling. And then later, when in school I started to took art as a subject, I really understood it. I really understood how images work and how important they are. And then I came to college and I read Karl Marx and was just, I'm going to a village, and my parents had to retrieve me from there. It was really something. I actually went and lived in a village in Orissa as part of it was a program for students. But I went there and refused to come back. And then my parents had to send for me. And then there was a holiday where I sulked and said, you're all like bourgeoisie. And, I had this whole thing going on. So I think somewhere I wanted to combine art and activism. That was my very naive thought. And at the time that I joined filmmaking, like you rightly said, the only thing really you could do was Doordarshan, And at the time in Jamia, we were the last batch that were paid to study.
Really?
Yeah, because it was a form of social work. Nobody's going to make money doing this.
That's interesting.
He's very interesting because at that time, film was what? It was one feature film every weekend. And there were X cinemas, and TV had a limited amount of content, and we had just got the Rajnis and those lovely hum logs Bunyad and gang when we were in school, So we had just it was just beginning to open up, but the thought was like I was so discouraged. I remember a lot of people sitting me down and telling me it's a mistake to try and be a filmmaker. But as willful women, I don't know why we're so willful, and I don't know why we're so convinced, but we always are, aren't we?
Absolutely.
And it always does turn out okay in the end.
Touch wood.
Yeah. So, we're both sitting here, so it must. But anyway, so and it was so funny, it's like time and place. And I think I'm a product of that. Because in the second year, suddenly you had satellite TV, which just completely boomed. It was unheard of. And then BBC wanted to produce something in India, and, everybody wanted to come to India and do something. Feature film still took some time, but TV was just opening up like mad. And suddenly at the end of those 2 years, First, we got the stipend to study. And then at the end of 2 years, everybody wanted to hire us, and pay us these fantastic salaries. And in fact, all these big companies that you see today, whether it's Amazon or, Viacom or TV18 or any of these, a lot of the people who are really senior are from these film schools.
Okay.
Because there's nobody else, right? Nobody understood the medium. Where would you go to get somebody to be a reporter? So, yeah, I mean, I just came into it and started in the beginning with TV. Actually, for 1 year, I worked in a studio because I had this thing in my mind, like I really wanted to do a lot of work and get my craft sorted out. So, overthinking even then. But anyway, but I did that. And I think what it did was, it paid me really well because I just was in a studio and they were very grateful that I turned up and I got to make.
I love that. They were very grateful that I turned up.
Yeah, because of some trained filmmaker and not just, somebody. So, and I came in there and I got charged to do things from beginning to end. And these were not pieces of works of art, but they were, a film on the forestry department, for example, or, the women had the first expedition to the Everest of women of Indian women. And I did a documentary on that. And I mean, I didn't go with them, but of course I got the footage. So I'm saying that it was suddenly I had my hands on the craft and felt really confident after a year. Then I joined Raghav Behel, who I was one of the, I would say not the first few, but I'd say maybe the second or third lot who came in there and started TV18. And it was a lovely atmosphere in TV at the time. It was not like it is now. There was some amount of, I think, idealism, and there was still like filmmakers doing that job. And we were really worried about how something was framed. And, we were in that. So I did that for a while. I did TV, lots of it. And then it came to a point where TV really started to become TV, which was hugely dissatisfying to me as a creative person. And at that time, I'll never forget, because Raghav Behel actually said to me, he said, you should do fiction. And I felt like I was being expelled. I said, he's trying to get rid of me and he doesn't want me around. Why does he want me to do fiction?
But he probably saw something in you that
exactly.
was more geared for fiction.
Yeah. I mean, now looking back as a person who's done a whole lifetime of this, I do look at some of my initial work and think I was just actually doing fiction. I was very interested in facts, but then I wanted to represent them within editorials, with my own way of thinking about it, which documentary actually you shouldn't do on documentary. So anyway, I did that. And then I formed my own company with my ex-husband at the time and started doing a lot of documentaries.
Okay.
And these were essentially for networks abroad. So BBC and Channel 4 and things like that. Won a bunch of accolades along the way. And then realized that there's kind of a glass ceiling where Indian documentary produced by a Western network, because they want to see a certain India. It's kind of fair. Like, I don't want to go to America and see the same thing I see here. I'd like to see something that I can't see here. And so they weren't really interested in the independent women. They weren't really interested in the modern stuff. So I ended up doing a lot of work in the area of culture and religion. It wasn't designed. I just ended up, you do 1 year. So Kumbh Melas, and a lot of time with the Naga Sadhvis, and a lot of time with these in this world. It was eye-opening for me. As an urban woman, and even though I did documentary and I did live in the village, I was still essentially quite an urban person. So with my own ideas of how things work, and this really threw me in there, and a whole world opened up. And I do remember being at the first Kumbh Mela, and I'm sure it's the case with you. We at the time got married quite early and had our kids quite early and all that. So my daughter was at the time 4, and I left her behind and I went to shoot at the Kumbh Mela. I just remember at that time thinking, this is sort of magical, the magic part was really to do with the fact that it was religion, but it was just not really religion. I mean, it was more, there was something much deeper going on. It's hard for me to explain. It had nothing to do with, I'm not a religious person. I'm spiritual, yes, but I'm not religious. But I felt something there. And you see the discipline with which people come, or with the amount of love they come, and it's kind of beautiful. Like it's chaotic, it's beautiful, and it's like a microcosm of our country. I think it was about then I really got to know my country and started to fall in love with it, And then, it went on, and I just felt like I'm not going to go much further. And I just want to take a little sojourn to talk about a very important episode in my life that guided my creativity. So he at the point didn't tell me who it was, but just said there's a filmmaker and his entire crew, and they're coming to shoot. And not only do you have to kind of coordinate, but do a little assistant work. It's a bit like, I don't know if I want to assist, and I'm a director myself, and I was having this, I was like,
Little did you know.
Little did I know. So then I asked him for the list of crew, because, you have to get it cleared at customs and so on and so forth. And anyway, to cut a long story short, I thought he was joking. And I said, could you just send me the real list? Because says Werner Herzog. And come on, shut up. He's like, it's him. So I spent the next 5 days panicking.
Were you in a state of shock?
Yes, I was panic struck. I was just completely like, when he's standing in front of me, what should I do? Like, I was thinking of imaginary conversations with this man. And so, of course. But luckily what happened was that, another loop of some sort. I'd done some tarot card readings. I don't know why I was doing tarot card readings at the time, but I was.
More talents to you.
Go on, everybody's tried this nonsense at some time, haven't they? Something.
No, I haven't actually read the tarot cards, but I keep seeing the Insta reels which keep telling me somebody's going to return into my life. So I'm still waiting. To come back to Werner.
yeah, come back to Werner. So anyway, I'd done some tarot card readings for a man who actually was running the airport.
Mm-hmm.
So I called him and I said, there's this gentleman coming and he's very special and you just cannot make him wait at any point. Again, it was a time when you could do this stuff. I guess if I did it today, somebody would put it on Twitter and everybody would get fired. But it didn't, it was not Twitter yet. Anyway, whatever it was, so he got off the plane and I was able to actually go, not to the tarmac, but the little vestibule when they come out and bring him. He was highly impressed. Naturally, being Herzog, that's the kind of stuff he would be. And his half brother and his manager, Luki Stepatik, he manages everything. So he's lovely, lovely, lovely man. Anyway, to cut a long story short, Herzog arrived and all the Lufthansa air hostesses were just fainting. In India, of course, nobody had any idea.
Heard of him.
And as luck would have it, everybody's car came, but not Herzog. Because that's what filmmaking is, actually. It's such an enterprise that unless you're willing to throw your, throw yourself body first into it, it's not going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And second thing he said to me was that facts are the accountant's truth.
Oh, that's very, very deep, very loaded.
Yeah.
Facts are the accountant's truth.
Yeah. So I could tell you that there 20 people fell from a building. It's a fact. But the truth could be just something entirely different. Did they jump? Were they pushed? We don't know, right?
That's the storyteller's truth.
That's right. So he insisted because and in the beginning, even at the time when he said it to me, I took it like an affront. It's like saying the truth doesn't exist. It's my truth. It's a kind of egocentric way of looking at it. But honestly, what he was saying, and I have understood over the years, which is so true, is that own the truth. Don't go in there and pretend it's not yours, because God knows no matter how objective you are, your truth will present itself.
And your truth is your truth, and no one else can tell it.
Exactly.
So if you don't own it, who will?
Exactly. So if I present to you a film and say, I own everything, or I could say, oh, it's a story, and I say, I told it exactly as it happened.
Then you're a reporter.
That's right. You're a reporter, you're an accountant.
Yeah. You're just telling,
you just
setting the facts out.
Yeah. Then there's none, then you cannot be an auteur. You cannot be a person who has a story to tell.
How did your first story come about then?
So I was in a terrible marriage, rather abusive. And it was a very tough time in my life. And I do remember thinking about a kind of idea of having a lover who doesn't exist. Because if something physically exists and you're in a very contentious kind of situation, you could more or less use it as like it could complicate things. Like if I really started to have an affair, it would be at a time when my marriage is breaking. Be no time, and secondly hard. So I started to think about it, and it just stayed in my mind. And then I started to question why my ex-husband was jealous. Why it is that he was constantly telling me I'm not there, like he thought I was having an affair, which I was clearly not. And I just was so stumped by it. But when we separated, there's like a little relief there. And it occurred to me that my creativity was just too large for another person to get, because I had got together with him when I was very young. So that time my creativity was presenting differently. Then over the years I'd got, done a bit of work, got awarded, got a sense of the world and my filmmaking and what I wanted. And it was a lot,
It threatened him.
Yeah, he didn't understand it. He knew something was standing between us, or he felt it was standing between us. He knew something else was drawing me away. He couldn't put his finger on it. And it's occurred to me that's a bit like having an imaginary lover, right? Something that doesn't exist, but it does. Because I'm in love with something else. Although it's not a man, it's still love.
Okay.
I mean...
So that's how
the idea
story came about.
Yeah. And I literally wrote it in the wake of my divorce. Actually, I wrote Kajaria at the time my daughter was born.
Okay. So it was written back then.
Back then. And then I parked it. It was too hard a film to make at that time. So then I wrote my first film, and I literally wrote it sitting in bed. At the time, my ex-husband and I had got separated. It was a very tough time, getting used to being single and a new world and everything. So I literally sat in the bed, she's sleeping next to me, and I wrote it. And then it got made, which was a bit of a miracle. I think that was just amazing, because I made a short film before that. So I did it. I mean, it's not like I just, ambled into it, because a lot of people look at what you've done and think, oh, you've been really lucky or whatever. It's not like that. One works very hard. So I'd made a short film first, which I really, I sort of put my craft and art into it, and it did really well. It won festivals, blah, blah, blah. And then at the Mumbai International Film Festival here, I won the Silver Conch and, whatever.
What was it called?
Walking on a Moonbeam. It was actually a film about child sexual abuse, but I dealt with it in a kind of retrospective way, a woman thinking back to the time and her childhood and her, everything. It was a short film, it did very well. So that film, and it's, I took it to studios and showed it, and I had no experience of Bombay at all. I had never worked in Bombay. I'd always worked in Delhi. I had always worked on the international circuit. My brush with Bollywood is very much like friends or people I knew, or directors I knew, but I had never worked here. So I just did the brave thing of, I had the script, I wanted to make it, and I moved with my daughter to Bombay. And she was at the time, I think maybe 7, 8 or something like that. And I think within about 2 months, I had the film going.
You were ready to die for it now.
Yes, you're so right. I mean, so yeah, absolutely. I was ready to die for it. And I think that's when you sit in bed and write a script, even though your marriage is falling apart, because you're dying to do it. And of course, in retrospect, now when I look back, and I know I was dying for it. At the time, I just didn't even understand what this longing was, honestly. It was just beyond me. I just couldn't. Me and my what I was thinking, every time I was separated from it, I felt like a lover had gone. You know, it was like a longing I can't explain to you. Like I just had to write it. I just had to make it. You know, I just let's get the crew together and make a short film. And you know, it was just like I had to. That image became so important. That word became so important. You know. Yeah, and so then the film happened. But I guess I didn't know Bombay at all, and nobody knew me here. And so it turned into the usual Bombay story. You know, you have that in the films, no? Somebody came at the railway station and their portly gets taken away and all that, and they just left in the lurch. Something like that happened to me. So it's not now in retrospect when I talk to people, they tell me it's quite usual, and you know it happens all the time, although it's not correct, but it does. So I moved back then to Delhi and made Kajaria.
Tell us about Kajaria. Kajaria is the one that has been stunning people all these years and continues to do so.
Yes. Yeah, so my daughter was born in this nursing home, which was, you know, sort of like these very well-to-do women. And she was born a girl and no other girl was born. So I started asking the nurse. I was like, you know, it's just curiosity. I just want to see when another girl is born, like what they look like, you know. So waiting, you know, and I had a cesarean, it was a bit complicated. So I was there 10 days. So the rooms were changing every 3 days. Women would have their babies and leave, and no girls being born. So when it was like about 6 days, like 2-3 rounds had happened, the nurse sort of said to me, well, then there aren't going to be any girls born. And I said, why? He says, oh, that one in that room, she had a boy, then she had an abortion, and now she's going to have a boy again. It's like, no, come on, it can't be. Like, I just thought, this woman's crazy, you know. And I told my mother at the time, and she was very quiet. She didn't say anything. She didn't tell me it's true or anything. I don't think she also really thought about it. Anyway, went home, the whatever that life insurance thing that you want to get done, and you know, and he said, please don't do this LIC thing, you know, because I said do it for like 40 years or whatever. He's like, no, kuch jo uski shaadi se pehle it should mature and all. It's like, why? He says, you know, they're born girls. So, and then some relative of my ex-husband's who actually he was very furious with, came in and said something like, oh, it'll be better next time. And I thought actually she's talking about the cesarean. So I started telling her about my cuts and wounds and she's very flummoxed. So, and he threw her out and I was like, what's going on? So there was a series of these events and I just looked at my little girl lying there thinking, I mean, it's ridiculous. What are you talking? I mean, how can you even say stuff like that? 2 years, when she was about 2 years old, I opened the newspaper and there was an interview of a reporter talking to a dai who kills baby girls. And that interview was horrible because the interviewer is saying to her, don't you feel bad doing this? And she says, oh, I feel terrible. And she said, well then, you know, and so the questions are a bit like lecturing her, you know, so you should break out of it, you should stand up for it, and you should refuse. And, you know, this woman is saying, yes, you're right, you know, she also doesn't know what to say to such a person. But at the end, she said something like, look, I am just the hangman. Somebody else is sentencing them, and, you know, maybe you should
speak to them. And maybe in her head, I don't know, I'm just theorizing here, she thinks she's doing the child a favor.
Yeah, I mean...
given the circumstances in which the child would grow up.
Yeah. I you know, so I did after that, then I said, okay, what the hell, you know? So I started to write something around it. But then I said, I need more information. So I went in and I started speaking to people who work in the area, social organizations, dais, midwives, people who have actually aborted girls,
Okay.
women. So when all in all, the fact is that you create a situation where it just seems like a better idea to kill her, like you said. And you create a situation where you equate one gender with you having won, and one gender with me having lost, so to speak. So a woman who has no career, who has nothing, has very few ways of winning. And that's made clear to her,
Her reproduction and what she reproduces.
And what gender.
With what gender? Exactly. This film has gone all over the world.
Yeah.
It's been at all the major festivals.
Yeah.
It's won accolades. Have you ever been tempted to do something again in that specific space?
Yes, actually, my next film is called Yellow Line.
Okay.
But it's not the specific space. The space is basically to talk about how society creates a circumstances. In the case of Kajaria, a circumstance creates a person, a circumstance that was not of her making. She didn't choose any of those circumstances. She just picked from the 5 or 2 choices that were given to her. And mostly it was between death and that. So she just chose life really for herself. But a lot of my themes revolve around kind of how people are united by circumstance or united by a thought process. So for example, the thought process is that girls are inferior to boys, that women don't really belong out in the world, that women don't, these are. So there's one woman who has totally bought it on the face of it. Kajaria, she just buys it. But Meera is pretending like she doesn't buy it. But it's not up to her, right?
And Meera is?
The reporter.
The reporter in Kajaria.
Yeah.
Right.
That's right. The reporter in Kajaria. She's a modern Indian girl living on her own terms and thinks that's all she needs to do. But really, she's born in a time. She's born in a place. And those seriously restrict her choices. Seriously. And it's a discovery we all make.
Absolutely. I think wherever you think you're urban emancipated, whatever,
Yeah.
but there are still some cages and some shackles
Yes.
around you. Lovely. So Yellow Line is coming up next, is
Yes.
it? Is it ready and about to be released? Or
No, I haven't shot it yet.
You've
It's
written
cast,
it? And
I've cast it and it's written. It's too early to talk about who's doing it, but they're in place now, the actors. So I'm just looking for the money for it. And this is a kind of a tale of 3 characters. One who's a young woman with a startup. No surprises there. I mean, although I'm not young, but a younger woman. And a man who lives in Lutyens, Delhi, and a prostitute. So
Okay.
it's the story of these 3 people's lives and how they get united.
lovely, on the Yellow Line.
On the Yellow Line. The Yellow Line is a metro line, right? You know that in Delhi. So
Lovely. Looking forward to that. But
Yeah.
I'm very curious. You are a writer. You take your own stories onto film.
yeah.
When you write, it's a very lonely process.
Hmm.
It's a process where you get into your own head and you have to work with your own demons. When you're making a film, it's a very collaborative process. There's everything. There's the cast, there's a crew, there's the producers, it's like an entire circus. How do you reconcile these 2 aspects of filmmaking?
Writing is the nicest part, because you always have control over what somebody will see or what they won't see, So a lot of people don't write because they're trying to write the perfect draft. Many people will write write 5 lines and say it's not good, So I don't do that. I just write. I just write. And a lot I just don't ever even bother about after I've written it. But there will be something that will keep bringing you back. So, like you must do, I'm always writing something at all times, you know. And there will be one such thing which will keep calling you back, you know. And it's calling you back because there's something that you have to say which is happening, which is like your own thought process. So I think a lot of the work of a writer or even a director is self-discovery.
Okay.
You have to spend a lot of time understanding what's important to you, why you're doing what you're doing. It's a very painful process. You have to dig deep to understand. And, you're always doing that. And then you can offer something to the world which is genuine.
You do this digging deep.
Yeah.
You also have to layer yourself.
Yes.
If you don't have depths within yourself to dig deep,
yes,
can you be a creator?
Yeah, but it'll be a creator of a certain kind, I think a lot of the creativity is defining what creativity means to you, because I think this creativity is not just writing, as you well know. I mean, I'm doing the app now. That's horribly creative as well, in its own way. And as I, because I had to, my relationship with numbers when I was running a production house, I never had to raise money from anybody. I gave budgets, spent them, and made money. But with free, it's different. I need to be on top of my business plans and so on and so forth. So I have actually even personally been able to create like a storytelling in numbers.
Mm-hmm.
But honestly, if you want, like, it's funny you bring it up, because today I was just thinking about this, that there is a lot of creativity. People create things which are in our space. Some don't even register, some semi-register, some even are sort of well-known at the time. But what really lasts time is creators who dug deep to a universal experience.
Centered in the local space.
Centered in your own circumstance.
Mm.
And as local as you get, the more global you are. Because at the end of the day, the more rooted a story, the more true it is for many other such people.
Lovely. I think that's very important. I think everyone's chasing to get the perfect story out that international audiences can understand and, water it down, make it accessible, make it understandable. But what it does, it just dilutes the essence of the story. So I love that you bring that point up.
I mean, honestly, I think creativity ends if you start thinking about who's reading it.
Exactly.
That's exactly the moment. If you are making the film thinking about who's watching it, it's over for you. Then it's not a create. Then you are doing something like else. You're doing like an ad.
You're creating a product for a market.
Creating a product for a market, which is fine, which is okay. It has its place. But of course, we can ascribe to one or the other.
So, Madhurita, tell us a little bit about Free. You just spoke about it and how it is also a form of creativity to found something, to start something. How did that come to you? Because it's completely, of course, it's within the space that you do as a creator and a filmmaker. But an app for safety is different from making films. So how did that happen?
So first of all, we all know that filmmaking is changing and storytelling is hugely changing, because you have to, I feel like if you have all the devices and you don't use them, then you're actually doing disservice.
Mm-hmm.
If you're a creative person, you should be able to, these things are just devices, right? So, my daughter started going out as teenagers do. And I started looking for places, ratings, like 2 a.m. one day. I was just trying to see wherever she's gone, whether there's a safety rating. It really infuriated me because there were ratings for ambience even.
But no safety ratings?
Nothing. Food, lighting, everything. But how safe it is? No mention. Then I started thinking about why. Because safety is really supposed to be a personal, it's your problem. It's not my problem. But actually, it's not up to you. You can do nothing. The only thing you can do is to not go out, which is actually counterproductive, right? So anyway, so I thought somebody's got to do this. And I first tried to get other people to do it who didn't listen. And then I just jumped in and did it. That's what it happened. It's like, they were like telling me things like women are irrational and what if they rate badly? I said, yeah, but What do you mean? They don't sit in Ubers and rate. They're rating all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, safety is special, and you have to take care of it in a certain way. But the ratings are totally valid. So yeah, that's where it started out. Then like it happens if you have a good idea. So I was sitting with in Palo Alto, and my co-founder, he was there, and he said, "I'll build it for you." So we started. I had a friend who did the logo.
Lovely.
And then another dear friend who's quite well off, gave me my
Seed
angel
funding.
round.
Lovely.
So now we're seriously raising the first round
Okay.
because we do have 15,000 downloads.
Wow.
And the thing is, actually, free is different from everything else because we do safety ratings. Nobody else is doing it. So we are actually generating safety data for spaces, streets, areas, everything. So it's quite unique.
Have you ever thought of collaborating with any governmental organizations for this? Or?
Yes, I will. I mean, I think eventually once we get volume, we will. We need, you need that million. But of course, we're constantly in touch with law enforcement. In fact, in Haryana, when we were doing our on-ground exercise, I went to speak to the cops and he said, "Look, can you just rate some spaces unsafe?" I said, "We can't do it.
Why?
People have to do it." He says they're very unsafe and we don't have enough police force. We just don't want people to go there. He's saying tourists, the tourists at least should know that it's unsafe. It's like, I can't do that. Somebody's got to go there and rate. I can't just sit here and rate, So they also are looking for something like that, and I will most certainly be doing that. Yeah.
All the very best for that. And
Yeah.
finally, I need you to tell me about your book that's on its way.
Yeah, so this September, hopefully, or October, Krishna Circus will be out. And it's a story of a female superhero who comes back from ahead in
Science
time.
fiction, I love it.
Yeah, it's real fun because it's all about sort of Kans and Krishna. But,
Ah.
yeah, so Kans has got Mathura in a dome. It's 100 years from now.
Mm-hmm.
And there is everybody else is dead, and he has only immortals because there's a astrologer who said Krishna will be born and will kill you. And then Vasu and Devki come, and there is a gynecologist called Yashoda who's not given birth to anybody, who whistles them in. And the child is born, but it's a girl.
Lovely.
Krishna.
Krishna's a girl.
And then she has a tent, a magic tent that goes back and forward in time.
Okay. Very interesting.
Yeah.
I love it. I love that, you're writing in a space that is a little removed from your filmmaking.
Yeah.
Science fiction is
Yeah.
fantasy. It's like suspend your imagination,
Yes.
all those things. Whereas your work was very rooted in real issues that women face. But yes, you do have the feminist angle.
Yeah.
And women are becoming superheroes in your book. So
Yes.
all the very best for the book.
Thank you so much, Kiran, and really nice chatting with you.
Pleasure, and all the very best for free and whatever other work that you're coming up with next.
Thanks
Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you.